In recent years, social media sites such as Facebook and Twitter have been hailed as a valuable new tool in the fight for democracy. Back in 2009, protests against the disputed elections in Iran were transmitted via Twitter, leading some commentators to dub it the Twitter revolution. But in his new book, The Net Delusion, The Dark Side of Internet Freedom, Evgeny Morozov of Stanford University warns that the phenomenon is also assisting the cause of authoritarian regimes, with governments mastering the use of cyberspace for disseminating propaganda and for surveillance of dissidents. I spoke to Evgeny Morozov earlier today in the ABC's Washington studio. Evgeny Morozov, your book is called The Net Delusion. How have we been deluded?
Well, there are two ways. First, I think, is the assumption that the internet will help to promote democracy and that it will actually lead to greater good and more people being empowered. I think this is one element of the delusion. And the second element is a bit more pragmatic. It's the belief that governments like the American one or the European Union would actually be able to use the internet and technology and new media to promote democracy around the globe. So in a sense, it's being deluded about the impact of the internet itself, but also being deluded about the ability of Western governments to use the internet to promote democracy.
Let's focus on the Iran elections. You write of a type of techno-utopianism among journalists and politicians, some of whom labelled the protests as the first Twitter revolution. You say that claim is hollow. Can you explain that?
I think there was definitely a lot of enthusiasm about the role that Twitter played in facilitating the protests in 2009 when so many people poured into the streets of Tehran. If you, however, look at the data a bit more closely, what you see is that Twitter played the greatest role in actually publicizing these events and in getting the information out. It was not instrumental in getting people into the streets. What happened afterwards, I think, however, was completely lost in much of the media coverage. What happened is that the Iranian government started tracking everything that was posted to Twitter, to Facebook. They started collecting photos of people who participated in the protests. They started posting them on government sites and asking people to identify who those people were. They started sending threatening Facebook messages to Iranians abroad, telling them not to get involved. And of course, all of the Iranians who were careless enough to go online and tweet and post Facebook messages under the real names got into trouble. Eventually, some of them were investigated, some of them were interrogated, and so forth. And this last element of the government actually using the information published online, that was not actually covered as widely as the Twitter revolution that, more or less failed to lead to any concrete political gains for the Iranian opposition.
So would you say that digital campaigns need to be combined with some form of mainstream opposition movements to be effective?
Well, usually, yes. I would say that the internet is most effective when it's actually used by existing political and social movements and by people who are actually knowledgeable about new media and who know how to raise money online or to mobilize people around particular causes. However, I think there is also a darker, element of this as well, because in many authoritarian states that I have been studying, like Belarus or like Egypt or like Russia or China or Iran, we also see that a lot of young people are actually only eager to participate in politics through virtual means. I mean, for many of them, there is this thing called virtual politics, and they think that by joining Facebook groups or by posting messages to Twitter, they actually are affecting a change on the ground. And I think from this perspective, many of the traditional political and social movements may actually be losing a lot of potential contributors.
Do you think we need to get a better handle on what governments are doing to control the internet?
Sure. Well, I think we have initially got a very misleading view of how the governments would be controlling cyberspace. The assumption that many people made in the 90s was that all of this control will be happening through internet censorship. We all heard about the Great Firewall of China. I mean, this metaphor appeared first in an article published in 1997 in Wired magazine, and since then, the Great Firewall of China has become the leading metaphor for thinking about government control over the internet. However, I think we also need to pay attention to other means through which governments influence and control the web. Some of them include cyber attacks, for example, on websites of dissidents or of independent media. And these cyber attacks are also, in most cases, anonymous. They're very hard to trace to whoever ordered them, so the governments are also spared much of the blame. So I think what we need to do over the years is to basically get a more sophisticated view of what control of the internet entails. It's definitely more than censorship only. As I've mentioned, it's also propaganda, it's governments trying to manipulate public opinion online, it's also governments, and particularly governments like Russia or China, having their government-friendly oligarchs and private players purchase major stakes in big companies on the internet, and then enforce very strict, climate for freedom of expression there. So we do need to get a more sophisticated vocabulary of what actually counts as internet control and go beyond censorship only.
So what do you believe is the best way forward? How should this tool be used?
Well, the major question that I've been trying to answer in the book is how the Western governments, how the American government, how the Western European governments, and the Australian government also, how they can actually go about using the internet to promote democracy and to try to defend democracy even. And I think the best way to do it is to actually be as much attentive as possible to the social and political and cultural conditions on the ground. What needs to happen is for these governments to stop making big assumptions about the internet, because there is very little in common that the effect of the internet will have in Russia and China and a country like Venezuela. The effect of the internet on the politics and culture and society of those countries will be different. In a country like Russia, you do need to consider the impact that the internet will have on religion, on nationalism, on corruption, on government legitimacy, and many of these factors will have a rather dubious and ambiguous effect on democratization. It's not actually certain that the fact that Russian nationalists get empowered will actually have a positive contribution to the process of democratization in Russia. So we do have to consider the richness of the social and political conditions before drawing any major conclusions about the role that the internet will play. So my message is stop thinking about the internet, start thinking about politics, and then see how the internet affects it.
Evgeny Morozov, thanks for speaking to us.
Thanks so much for having me.